This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, explaining the predator-prey dynamic between coyotes and deer. Agricultural economist from K-State Robin Reid and agricultural policy specialist Jenny Ifft continue the show by discussing managing risk with ARC and PLC and an upcoming webinar. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk expects milk margins to again be tight in 2024, and as he rounds out today's show, he encourages dairy farmers to act quickly when the sign-up date for the Dairy Margin Protection Program is announced. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. So I'm excited to chat more today, Drew, about coyotes again. We talked last time, or a couple times ago, last time you led the session, about coyotes and livestock. Today we're going to focus on coyotes and their effect on deer. So should we be concerned about coyotes when it comes to deer populations? Throw you right into it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really good question, and I think it's a question that we have some good evidence for. I also think that it really depends on where you're at. And, I think just talking about the role of coyotes as predators for deer is the first thing we should start with. And along with that, it's important to think about the fact that predation is a natural phenomenon, right? We have predator and prey relationships for many, many, many species, and most prey species produce a surplus that can handle quite a bit of predation from native species. When we have predators that become introduced into an area or that naturally colonize an area where they weren't before, then sometimes things get out of balance. And those might be situations where we need to think about this. And kind of another interesting thing to think about is that really the reason that a lot of hunters and a lot of managers think about coyote predation on deer is the fact that coyotes are actually a competitor with humans for deer as prey. And that's one of the reasons we have a lot of negative feelings about them. Right, and kind of another interesting thing to go along with that is, coyotes are a lot smaller than us, right? And so we have these negative feelings about them and the fact that they're killing deer, and that's a phenomenon that happens in nature too.
Humans tend to, go out and hunt larger deer generally, and is that the same thing coyotes are generally going after?
It's not. No, typically, coyote predation is very important for fawn recruitment sometimes. Coyotes are really one of the most common predators of deer fawns. They are typically not, in most places, a common predator of adult deer, whether we're talking about mule deer or white-tailed deer. Now, there are cases where they can be. But in the vast majority of studies that have been done, coyotes are preying on fawns. They're impacting fawn survival sometimes. But they're not typically a source of adult mortality.
Are deer fawns a large portion of their diet generally?
Well, we'll get to that in just a second. One of the things I wanted to talk about first was what we see in terms of actual, coyote impacts on fawn survival. Sure. What percentage of fawns that are lost can be due to coyote predation and that sort of thing. We did a pretty large-scale study out in western Kansas, and in that study, about 30 to 40% of the fawn losses were attributed to predation, and coyotes were the most common predator. And we can see similar numbers in a lot of different places, but coyotes typically are going to be the predator that's most commonly responsible for predation on white-tailed deer fawns or mule deer fawns. So they're important for both species. So predators in general tend to focus on more vulnerable individuals, and they can be more vulnerable because they're sick or something else is going on, they're injured otherwise. The challenge with those brand new fawns is their predator avoidance strategy is to hide and try and remain totally still, and a predator, one of those brand new fawns, a predator can even grab a hold of it and start to chew on it, and they're going to still try and hide. So that's a pretty poor predator avoidance strategy if you get caught. But coyotes tend to really capitalize on resources that are easy to get and abundant when they're available. So, we talk about the deer fawns. That's probably an opportunistic thing. If a coyote comes across a deer fawn while it's out hunting for rabbits, it's going to take that fawn, right? But I don't know, nobody probably knows this, but a coyote probably doesn't wake up and decide it's going to go hunting for deer any given day.
So we're seeing an increase in the number of coyotes, and we've seen, an increase in deer. At least deer populations have maintained kind of a consistent number. I guess the concern would be that you start getting so many coyotes that they can eat all your deer, and your deer population crashes. Is it reasonable to think that coyotes could eat enough deer that we see their populations crash?
Well, it could be, and that's definitely something that a lot of people think about. And being the nerd that I am, I went and got a bunch of numbers to try and estimate the number of fawns that coyotes could kill in Kansas based on the data that we have. So to look at that, I looked at about a 10-year summary of the distance sampling data that Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks collects. And so from that data, we have some estimates of the total number of deer in Kansas. And one of the more recent estimates that I've found from that, at least from that publication, was like from 2016 or thereabouts. And at that time, it was about 690,000 deer. So based on our distance sampling data across 10 years, the 10-year average for does was about 42% of our deer population is does. Okay, so 42% of 700,000 is 294,000. A nice round number to say how many fawns does the average doe give birth to is about 1.5 fawns per doe. So 1.5 fawns times 294,000 gives us about 440,000 fawns. Okay, so that's how many are born in a year. That distance sampling data is done in the fall. So it's done after our fawns are done being vulnerable to predation and most other sources of mortality besides human-caused mortality and those sorts of things. So that number is 25%. So we typically are going to see about 25% recruitment of our fawns into the population. So if 25% of 700,000 are the fawns that survive, then we have about 175,000 fawns survive every year. So 440,000 or 441,000 actually minus 175,000 is 266,000 fawns that die on an average year in Kansas. Okay, so that's the maximum number in an average year that's available for coyote predation. And we know that there's lots of other sources of mortality, but let's just assume that coyotes did get them all in 1 year. Well, how many coyotes are there in Kansas? We don't know for sure, but there are some good publications, some good estimates in the literature out there, and based on those estimates, I think a good round number to say the average coyotes per square mile, given the differences in density that we might see across the whole state, is about 5 coyotes per square mile. So that means there's somewhere around 400,000 total coyotes. Another number might be 411,000. So if we take 266,000 fawns preyed on by 411,000 coyotes, so the maximum number of fawns killed by the average coyote is 0.65, which is a whole lot lower than a lot of the numbers that I've seen people put out there when they're trying to justify their coyote killing activities. So I think the big question is, should a deer hunter in Kansas worry about coyotes? And if you're in Kansas and probably most of the Great Plains, at least north of South Texas, but we probably don't need any more deer than we have. And coyotes really probably aren't having a big impact on our deer based on all the data that we have in this area. But what's the research show? We need to think about, are there studies that have actually looked at the impact of removing coyotes on fawn survival? And there are. The most of those studies that are done on white-tailed deer are done in the eastern U.S., and they're done in those areas where coyotes have colonized since 1950 or later. So one of the really interesting things to me as a biologist and as somebody who does a lot of predator control work for livestock producers or helps livestock producers with predator control is that the effects of removing coyotes on fawn survival is incredibly variable. So I mentioned that fawns are most vulnerable during that first 10 weeks of their life. So really, if you're trying to reduce coyote predation on fawns, wherever you are, especially if you're in an area where coyotes are impacting your deer populations, then the timing really probably ought to be like, February or March all the way through September, so that you're limiting the ability for those transients to come in and make up for the individuals that you're removing.
I think the real take-home message is, should we be hunting coyotes?
Right, yeah, and I think it's kind of the same for me, at least in Kansas where we live and probably most of the Great Plains. I would think about this the same way I would think about it for livestock protection. If you enjoy hunting coyotes, if you enjoy trapping coyotes, then yes, it's something you ought to do. If you're a deer hunter and you're concerned about deer, then you ought to focus your management efforts directly on the deer rather than spending time coyote hunting, unless that's something that you also just want to do, right? So the habitat management efforts that you can do for deer would be the valuable thing to put your effort into.
Once again, that was K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken on another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers. You can listen to the full episode on the podcast streaming platform of your choice or by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Tuesday show discussing agricultural risk coverage and price loss coverage. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State agriculture economist Robin Reid and K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft. Robin, Jenny, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
Robin, as we're talking about ARC and PLC, what are they?
Well, these are programs that have been around since the 2014 Farm Bill, and most producers are familiar with them at this time. But the interesting thing this year, they will be making or having the opportunity to make another decision between ARC or PLC on their base acres, as we've had an extension of the 2018 Farm Bill until at least next September. We'll see where it goes from there. Hopefully a new Farm Bill is in the future. But right now, producers have that opportunity by March 15th to again elect PLC or ARC on their base acres. And just to give a brief overview of those two programs again, remember PLC, price loss coverage, just like its name says, is the one that pays producers if the national market year average price falls below a certain threshold. And then they get paid the difference in that based on their program yield of the farm, so their established yield with Farm Service Agency. Now, the exciting thing about PLC this year, we've had the same reference prices ever since the 2014 Farm Bill. This year, those prices will be going up, and it's not because we have a new Farm Bill. It's because in the 2018 Farm Bill, there was some price escalators built into there. So if certain conditions were met, previous year's prices, there's a formula that raises those PLC reference prices. So for the first year, those are increasing, and that will be $4.01 for corn, $4.06 for grain sorghum, $9.26 for soybeans, and unfortunately, wheat was the one that did not get the increase yet. It is still at $5.50. So producers, as they're looking at PLC, that is an important thing to think about this year, is those reference prices are significantly higher than in the past, but definitely not going to break the bank. But if you compare those with ARC County reference prices, there are some producers that may want to reconsider what program they sign up for.
Robin, can you tell us a little bit more about the ARC County?
Sure. So the ARC County program, again, this is the revenue-based program. So now we're not just looking at what are national prices doing. Now we're looking at what are national prices doing and county yield. So the revenue between that national price and the county yield compared to the benchmark. And again, those reference prices are going up. Those move a lot more year to year than our PLC do. But because we've had such good prices in the 5-year history, those prices have increased too. So we have corn this year, ARC County benchmark at $4.85, grain sorghum at $5.01, soybeans $11.12, and wheat at $6.21. So these are some higher reference prices than we've seen. And again, PLC I just mentioned as well, they are higher than these. But remember, the ARC County program is based on revenue. So it takes that national price times the county benchmark yield, and then you have to look at what actually happened. So when we get through harvest, we'll look at what is the marketing year average price for the entire next year as we harvest that crop, and then what was the county yield on that crop. And that will determine if there's a loss. You know, the one thing about this program is it doesn't pay until there's at least an 86% loss. So you can think about it as a crop insurance product with an 86% guarantee. But the other caveat is those payments cap off quite quickly. So 10% of the benchmark is all you can receive in those payments. So to kind of summarize those two programs, when we think about PLC, that's the program to be in if we really think commodity prices are going down, because that will continue to give payments until we hit the loan rate, which I sure hope we never see. The ARC County program, again, is the better revenue protection. We've seen some really big ARC County payments in recent years because of the drought, and that's because of that county yield component. So it is going to be a tough decision for farmers this year between those two programs, just because of all that uncertainty. And again, we won't start looking at this marketing year average really until June for wheat and next fall for our crops harvested then, corn, soybeans, and grain sorghum. And it'll be an entire year before we know that marketing year average. So there's so many unknowns with both of these programs and what they might pay.
And something that goes with those programs, Jenny, is the supplemental coverage option.
Right. The supplemental coverage option is an endorsement or an add-on that a producer can use on top of their existing crop insurance policy. Most field crop producers in Kansas and across the country use an underlying crop insurance policy. So in that way, SCO is very similar to ARC. It takes you from your underlying policy's coverage level up to 86%. And that's really because ARC and SCO were added to the Farm Bill at the same time in 2014.
Does the SCO usually go with the price loss coverage?
Yes. Typically, you can only use SCO if you selected price loss coverage. So the relevant comparison here is if you want to use SCO, you'll get PLC, but you won't get ARC. ARC is free. For SCO, you have to pay a premium. That premium is subsidized by the federal government.
What are the important things for people to know about SCO?
There's a couple things that are really important to keep in mind with SCO, like other high coverage policies. First of all, it will increase your costs, especially if you're at a 65-70% coverage level on your underlying policy. It's more intensive risk management, so there is a cost associated with that, even with the premium subsidy, which is substantial. Now that leads to my second point, is that producers using it should probably take a long-term perspective. Yes, you're going to be paying more money, but you should get more frequent payouts or larger payouts or both in the long term, but you can still go a couple years without a payout. So you need to understand what you're getting into this extra investment you're putting into risk management. The last point is like ARC, actually it's county based. The trigger is based on county yields, not your on-farm yields. So you need to understand the relationship between your on-farm yields and what happens in the county to understand how much risk protection SCO could provide.
So how might producers take that into consideration when they're deciding what they want to choose to use as their coverage?
Right. Well, this year and it relates to what Robin was talking about, there's really a shift between the value of protection provided by SCO and provided by ARC. So for the past few years, the SCO prices were higher than the ARC benchmark price. So effectively, your SCO guarantee would have been larger than ARC County. Now, you had to pay for that, but the value of what revenue is protecting was larger. And you see this with the 2022 drought, that similar policies with ARC and SCO would have paid out more for SCO because of those higher prices. But this year it's different. Like Robin mentioned, ARC prices The ARC benchmark prices are higher. And right now we haven't entered price discovery yet for corn and soybeans and sorghum, but it looks like those futures prices, those pre-planting prices that are used for crop insurance, are going to be very comparable to the ARC benchmark price that's used for that. So that guarantee, those guarantees are going to be pretty close, and that's a relatively new development from the past few years. There are two areas where SCO does provide more risk protection that I'd like to highlight. The first is that the harvest price option applies to SCO but not to ARC. What the harvest price option is, when prices are higher at harvest, your crop insurance guarantee resets at those higher prices. That is really useful during drought years. So you might have much lower yields, but market prices are going to be higher. With the harvest price option, your guarantee resets at those higher prices, and you get potentially higher payouts. Without that, those higher prices might offset the yield declines. So SCO could provide more protection in a drought year through the harvest price option. On the other side of things, you could have a high yield year with low prices. So PLC could provide some protection in those years where ARC wouldn't necessarily. So a couple different considerations this year.
So if people are wanting to find out more information about ARC and PLC, is there an opportunity coming up for them to do that?
Yes, Jenny and I are going to be doing a webinar together this Friday, February 2nd, starting at noon, and we are going to take a full hour just to talk through all of these different decisions to really help inform a producer in making these on the farm level. One thing I was going to mention as well, farmers have a lot of different FSA farm numbers typically, and they're going to be making a separate decision on each of those farm numbers, and how that interacts with SCO can be different on each farm. So it's a bigger and complicated decision. Producers really do want us to focus and spend some time making it this year. Again, both of those need to be made by March 15th.
For the webinar coming up this Friday, how much does it cost and where can they get registered?
It is free. You can go to AgManager.info. We would like people to register in advance. There's also a lot of other resources on AgManager.info to support this decision. So you can go there to see them. We'll also review them during the webinar.
Fantastic. Robin, Jenny, I appreciate you both taking the time to join us today and share with us a little bit about ARC and PLC and then also an upcoming webinar.
Thank you, Shelby.
Thank you.
That was K-State agriculture economist Robin Reid and K-State Flinchbaugh Agriculture Policy Chair Jenny Ifft. The upcoming webinar is this Friday, February 2nd, happening at noon, and it is free for attendees. And you can find more information about it on AgManager.info. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. After experiencing tight milk margins last year, dairy farmers are again likely to experience the same thing this year. As a result, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says that dairy farmers will again need to look for opportunities to reduce expenses, along with considering participation in the Dairy Margin Protection Program, which he says helped offset costs much of last year. Sign-up dates for that program have not yet been announced, but when they are, he recommends acting quickly.
Today I'd like to visit with the Kansas dairy producers concerning milk margins as we move into 2024. As most of you are painfully aware, we're still at a critical point with milk margins across the nation and also here in Kansas. As we look forward to 2024, it doesn't look like we're going to see a great increase in those margins. This would be due to the fact that milk price remains somewhat higher than it was in 2023, but still not at a great level. Grain prices have decreased a little bit, and that has spread that margin for us a little bit, but it's still at a critical level on most of our farms, and in many cases, depending on size of farm and other factors, may not be enough to cover all expenses. So as we look forward into 2024, there are some things that you might want to consider. The Dairy Margin Protection Program for 2024 has not yet been announced, Normally, producers have the opportunity to sign up for that in the fall, but due to changes in the Farm Bill, those dates have not yet been announced to sign up for the program. We do expect that when those dates are announced, it will be retroactive to the first of the year, so it will cover months that you haven't actually had a chance to sign up for at this particular time. This has happened in the past when there was uncertainty in the Farm Bill and what it might contain, so it's not unusual for us to see this happen. Just keep in mind that when those sign-up dates are announced, you'll probably have to act fairly quickly. Now, as you look at payments for 2023, if you had selected the higher level of protection, you receive payments, at least partial payments, in 10 of the 12 months. However, as we moved into November and also into December, we saw an increase in the margin because of slightly higher milk prices and slightly lower feed prices, so payments were not available even at the higher level. The other challenge with the program is currently you can only protect about 5 million pounds of milk for the year under this program. Again, there has been some talk there might be some changes to those levels, but those announcements have not been officially made, nor has it been determined that that will be something that is actually changed in the program as we move into 2024. So on many of our farms, we're going to just simply have to look for ways that we can increase margin on our own farms. That may mean that we need to look at ways we can cut expenses, become more efficient so that we can lower overall total cost for our operation. In some cases, maybe there's some things we can do on milk marketing to increase the dollars that we receive for our raw milk. However, these things are generally fairly limiting and do not necessarily apply to all farms. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to keep their eyes open for the Dairy Margin Protection Program announcement, as well as trying to do what they can do on their individual farms to increase margins in 2024.
Thanks, Mike. And this reminder to listen to the podcast version of Agriculture Today, visit agtoday.net, agtoday.net, or using an app on your mobile device, type these search keywords, Agriculture, Today, Kansas, and you'll find this program. By tapping the subscribe button, brand new episodes of Agriculture Today will automatically arrive on your device. That's agtoday.net. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.